Hi guys, in this video I'm going to go over two-dimensional static arrays, but before we do that, go to excelvbasequel.com. You could watch over 10 hours of video. More hours are being added all the time. Put your email in here and you could be updated when new videos get uploaded. All the videos are free to watch. You can also download the working Microsoft Excel workbooks and contact me here if you have questions. Okay, so let's get started. So before we looked at one-dimensional arrays, which could be static, meaning the size of the array didn't change. So we had numbers before in a couple of the other videos where we would declare an array of size 3 and put some numbers in it and deal with them and print them out and do stuff like that. We also looked at arrays that could vary in size, so a one-dimensional dynamic array, meaning sometimes the data would hold 5 values like this, and then other times we would need to hold 12 values or 11 values. And we would need to be able to dynamically expand the array. So we dealt with that already on a one-dimensional way by using a one-dimensional dynamic array that would resize using the redim keyword. So if you don't know what that means, go back and watch that video. It's on the one-dimensional dynamic array. Now we're going to get into the 2 dimensions and deal with a 2-dimensional static array, meaning you could think of a 2-dimensional array as just a matrix of rows and columns, right? So 2 dimensions meaning we have, let's say, 3 rows and 4 columns. Okay, and basically this structure here of 3 rows and 4 columns, whatever's in this structure at each cell, we want to put that in an array. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have, let's see, 12 elements in our array. And how it's going to be structured is our array is going to be dimensioned 3 rows by 4 columns. So you sort of think of it like a matrix for 2 dimensions. Okay. Now you could go into other dimensions. You could have 3-dimensional arrays. You could have 4-dimensional arrays. But I don't use that a lot. I don't think many developers do use more than 2 dimensions. So it's out there if you need it. If you need to go to 3 dimensions, but we're going to just right now work with 2 dimensions. So let's get started. Let's go to Alt F11. We're going to insert a module. And let's write some code here. So we're going to do sub 2D static array. Okay. So remember when we declared an array before, we did dim the name of the array. In this case, I'm going to name the array location. And before, for a one-dimensional, we put the size like this, right? And I'm going to make this of type variant. Okay. So this is a one-dimensional array that can hold 4 values. Remember, because arrays are based at 0. The size starts at 0. So for a 2-dimensional array, it's not too hard. All you gotta do is go like this, 3 by 3. So this means we can have 3 rows and 3 columns. But remember, arrays are based at 0, so this means 4 rows. It could hold 4 rows and 4 columns. So if I look at my worksheet, I want to populate this with some data. So I said I know 3 cities, and I'm going to put in 3 cities, and then I'm going to put the state that they're in, the zip, and the street. Okay, so I want an array that can hold 3, that is going to be 3 by 4, 3 cities, and then 4 columns that can hold the data. So I'm going to do 2 by 3. So remember, array started at 0, so this is going to be 2 by 3. And now let's populate the array. So you take the name of the array, right? And we're going to just build this array in the code. We could take it from a worksheet, but you could also just build it like this in the code. So I'm going to do location 0, 0, is equal to New York. And I'm just going to paste this down here, right? So this is going to be my first row. So what I'm doing now is, let me take a look at my worksheet. So I have state, zip code, and street. That's what needs to come after the city. So in the first column, this is the first row. So this is the row. This is the row dimension here. This 0 here, and this 0 here, and this 0 here. So this is all row, the first row, and the first row is indicated by zeros. So this dimension here, where I'm putting my cursor, this is the row dimension. So in the first row, first column, I put the city. First row, second column, which is going to be indexed by 1, you put the state. And then in the third column, you put the zip code. I'll just put something in there. And in the fourth column, indexed at number 3, you put the street. And I'm just going to put Main Street. Okay. So this is, in our two-dimensional array, this is row 0, column 0. And then row 0, column 1. Row 0, column 2, row 0, column 3. So all this right here is the first row with 4 columns. And if I go to the worksheet, it's going to be what I'm highlighting here. This is 0, 0, this is 0, 1, this is 0, 2, and this is 0, 3. This highlighted area, you could think of it exactly as what you see here. Okay, this is the first row, first column, first row, second column, first row, third column. Okay, so now let's do 2 more of these. So I'm just going to take this code and just copy it and paste it. And now instead of the first row, this is going to be the second row, indexed by 1 because arrays started 0, right? So I'm just changing 0 in the row dimension to 1. And then I'm going to change the values here. LA, CA, and I'm going to put okay. So what I did there is I created another row. So this is row 1, column 0, row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2, row 1, column 3. And if what I'm highlighting here, that can be looked at as a what's going to go right here. Okay? So if I just highlight what we already coded so far, we highlighted a structure that'll look like this, with 1 row, with actually 2 rows, and 4 columns. And let's do 1 more, just so you see. All we have to do here, again, is change this row dimension to 2. Because this is always going to have 4 columns. This column dimension, or this second dimension here, is always going to go from 1 to 4. But the row dimension is going to be increasing, right? So I'll put in okay, so now we have our array, our two-dimensional array, which you can think of, again, as just like a matrix. So if I run this, and I put a watch on location, now what do you think it'll look like in memory right here? So we just put a watch. When I expand this, what you see in the initial tree view is just the first dimension. When I say first dimension, I mean if I scroll up to the top, this right here is the first dimension. And you see it goes from 0 to 2. And you see that the first dimension is sized at 2, meaning it's going to have 3, it's going to hold 3 things, right? Or 3 rows, however you want to think of it. It holds 3 things. But then within that space, it has a second dimension that can hold 4 things. Okay? So you see, you tree into it initially and you only see the row dimension, 3 rows. But then if you tree into it again, now you see that that row has actually 4 column entries at 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, and 0, 3. And you could see it holds the values that we put in right here. And if I expand the row 1, you'll see again it has 4 entries, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, and 1, 3, which is exactly what we put in here, and it matches to what you see in memory. And then if you expand it again, you'll see down here that the second row, meaning the actual third row, but a zero base thing, right? So the second row, it has 4 entries again, which is exactly what we put in here. So here is how it looks in memory when you put a watch on it and you drill into it and you tree down. It doesn't look like a spreadsheet here. Okay, it's not going to look like a matrix that is 3 by 4. It's going to look like this. Okay, but there you could think of them sort of as the same thing, because it's saying on this dimension it can hold 3 things. But then there's another dimension that goes alongside that exists, and that other dimension can hold 4 things, right? So for every dimension you have here, you can have 4 things in it. You can have 4 spaces in it. So that's why it's 2-dimensional, because you're sort of building a matrix where for every element in one dimension, you're going to have more space in another dimension. Okay, more possibilities in that other dimension. Okay, so that's just what it looks like in memory. Okay, so now how do we print it out? I mean, how do you deal with this? So I'm just going to stop this. Well, we saw before in our other code that we used a for loop. And now we're just going to use a for loop again, right? But now, well, let me just write some code here. We're going to loop through this whole thing. We're going to loop through. What we're going to do is loop through and fill in the worksheet with our array. Okay? So let's do that. So let's write a for loop. And I'm just going to put a comment here. We're going to do for I equal to 0 to ubound location. And this is going to loop over the rows. So you should be familiar with this type of for loop, right? It's good for looping over arrays, and this ubound is the upper bound. It's the size of the array. But I want to show you one thing here. If I just put in ubound location and I put a message box, right? So if I stop here and I just run this, if I execute it, ubound location shows 2, okay? But that's really not correct, because ubound the upper bound of location, it is correct on the first dimension because the size of the array is 2 on the first dimension. But it doesn't, this ubound function, when you just write it like that, it doesn't tell you about the size of the other dimensions. So what you need to do is put a comma here and put which dimension you want the upper bound of. Okay, so you make a little change to this ubound function and you put the comma after the name of the array, and right here I'm saying give me the upper bound of the first dimension, and then I'll put another message box to say give me the upper bound of the second dimension. So if I just run this, there's 2, which is the upper bound of my first dimension, and there's 3, which is the upper bound of my second dimension. Okay, now this is important because in this for loop when I loop over the rows, I want to go from 0 to the number of rows, which is u bound comma 1. Okay, and then I want to loop over the columns, so I'm going to do for j equal to 0 to u bound location comma 2 next j. So you need 2 loops here to loop through this array. One for the rows, which is this dimension, all the zeros here, all the ones here, all the twos here. And at each loop, when I is equal to 0, then you want to loop again from 0 to 3. And then once you're done looping from 0 to 3, you go to 1 here, and you loop from 0 to 3 again. And then you go to 2, and you loop from 0 to 3 again. So you can see that there's 2 loops going on. The first loop loops over the rows, which are this dimension, 0, 1, 2. And the second loop, at each row dimension, at each whatever's in here, you got to loop 4 times to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. You go 0, loop 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, and then you go to 1 and you loop 0, 1, 2, 3, and then you go to 2 and you loop. So there's 2 loops going on. I'm just going to comment this out because we know what that is. U bound again is giving us the size of the arrays, and U bound with a comma and the 1 or 2 gives you the size of the array for a particular dimension. Okay, so now let's print out the array. So to do that, all you have to do is cells r comma c dot value is equal to location I comma j. Okay, and notice that this is the loop over the columns. So after I insert a value here, I want to set my column is equal to column plus 1. And then when I fall out of this loop, I want to increment my row, so I'm going to do r is equal to r plus 1. And I also, after I'm done with a row, so after I'm done looping and putting values in here, I want to set my row to another row, increment the row, but I also want to set my column back to 1 here. Because if I keep looping through the columns and I keep going, I'll go off this, I'll just keep going to the right, where I want to set it back to 1. So I'm going to put c is equal to 1. So what this loop is doing is the outer loop, this I loop, is going to loop through the rows. And at each row, it's going to loop through from 0 to the upper bound of the second dimension, which is the column dimension, and it's going to fill in these cells. So it's going to start here, and it's going to go here. It's going to put in data here, data here, data here, data here. Once it gets there, I increment the row, and I set the column back to 1. So it goes to this cell, and then I enter data, enter data, enter data, enter data, and then I increment the row, and I go back to this cell, and I increment the, put in the data here, right? So that's what's happening. So now let us run this and make sure that it works. So if I just hit run, you could see that the data is populated. New York, New York. Zip code is that zip code. Main Street, LA, California. There's a zip code. Boston, Massachusetts, zip code, First Street, right? Notice that it didn't keep going here because I set c equal to 1, right? And you increment the row. And that's basically how you populate a two-dimensional static array. Okay, so that is not too difficult. If you find that difficult, go watch the video on one-dimensional static arrays and one-dimensional dynamic arrays. And before I finish, let me just review a couple of the main points for this video. First, you could think of a two-dimensional static array as sort of like a matrix, right? And it's easy to visualize based on what we just did, right? We just populated a two-dimensional worksheet that has rows and columns. So you could think of it like that, or you could think of it like what you see when I run it and you go into the watch window and you see this, right? You could think of it either way, as a matrix or just a structure that has 3 rows, and within each element of the row dimension, it has 4 elements on the column dimension or the second dimension. I mean, you don't have to think of it as row column. You could just think of it purely in an abstract form. And okay, here's a first dimension that has space for 3, and a second dimension that at each space for 3 there's space for 4. Okay, so one's a little bit more abstract if you think of it, if you try to visualize it like this. But at the same time, this is exactly what corresponds to a matrix, which is very easy to visualize, which is exactly what I just highlighted here. Okay, so that's one key concept to remember for this video. The other key concept is, arrays start at 0, so when you're putting values onto them, remember to do it like that. 0, 0, 0 on the first dimension, 0 on the second dimension, and then increment that accordingly for however many rows you have. The other thing to remember is the U-bound. It was previously used in other videos to not be concerned with dimensions, and now when you're using multiple dimensions, you need to put a comma 1 to account for that. So to get the size of the array, on the first dimension you put the name of the array comma 1 using the U-bound function, and then the size of the array on the second dimension you do it like this: U-bound name of the array comma 2. And the final thing to remember about in this video is multiple loops. Okay, so the first for loop loops over the rows, and the second for loop loops over the columns. You don't have to do it that way. You can loop over the columns first and then loop over the rows. You can do it however you want. Most times it's done either rows first and then columns, but you could do it the other way, columns first and then rows. But dealing with these double loops, just get familiar with dealing with the indexes and incrementing them properly and using them in the right way. So here I have I comma j. So try to understand what's going on here. I is changing on the outer loop, and j here is changing on the inner loop. So the most important part of this whole code that I'm highlighting is this part right here, because all the code is basically to get to this part right here, to say where am I at in this matrix. And that's what these loops are for. It's a way to loop over every element, and to do that right here. This is where you're putting the element in the matrix into a cell or worksheet or whatever. And then remember to increment the column, but then set it back to 1. Okay, and then increment the row each time you're done with the row. So that's all I wanted to show for this video. Again, remember to go to Excel VBA SQL. What I'm going to do is take that code that you just saw, and I'm going to put it on this website, excelvbasequel.com, and you could download it, or you could come here and watch a lot more videos on Excel VBA. So contact me here if you have questions, and I'll get back to you soon. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later.